So what happens when a megachurch pastor gets honest about spiritual abuse and some of the ways it shows up in today's church? Well, we're about to find out because today's guest is a pastor on staff at one of the largest megachurches in the world. But before he came on staff at the megachurch, he spent decades in local church ministry. And in this episode, he gets brutally honest and incredibly vulnerable about his experience with spiritual abuse. And we talk about the other side of spiritual abuse and what it looks like when a pastor gets abused by church members and elders and board members. But we don't stop there. We also have a very honest discussion about some of the red flags and potential places where abuse could grow that he sees in the modern megachurch. Now, while his experience in the megachurch has actually been healing for him, he still sees that there are places we have to be extremely careful to make sure that we protect people. So we talk about that and more on this episode of the Church Disrupted podcast. This was a fantastic conversation that I don't think you're going to want to miss. So if you're ready, buckle up and let's jump in together to today's episode of the Church Disrupted podcast. Hey guys, welcome back to the Church Disrupted podcast with your host, Jeff Cochran. I'm really excited and intrigued about the conversation that we get to have today. Today, we're going to have a pastor who is part of a staff at a megachurch in the Southeast. And this is a large megachurch. We're going to have it, and we're going to have a conversation not just about spiritual abuse in the megachurch, but specifically how he found refuge and healing from the spiritual abuse he had experienced in the megachurch. We're going to talk about how spiritual abuse happens in smaller and mid-sized churches as well, because spiritual abuse is not a mega church only problem. The reason we see a lot of it in mega churches is because of the systems focus and some of the systems from mega churches that trickle down to other places. But this is not only a mega church problem, and I'm really excited to have a conversation about the other side of spiritual abuse. So welcome to the show, Loren Hildebrandt. Loren is, like I said, on staff at a large church in the Southeast. Loren, why don't you tell our audience just a little bit about you and what you do and just kind of how you got to where you are today. Go ahead and introduce yourself, and thank you so much for your willingness as a pastor to come on the podcast today.
I'm very blessed to be here. Now that your audience is seeing me, or they maybe can pick up by my voice that I am 61, so I've been in ministry for a long time, and I have 4 kids, almost 8 grandkids, have 2 more coming this summer. And I started my work life in television production and didn't make any money in that. And then I was a school teacher. And in the 90s, I was called by God to enter the pastoral ministry. So in 1996, I started doing that. And for 15 years, I was a pastor in 3 small churches here in the South. And in 2011, I went on my first global mission trip, and God utilized that to turn my world upside down. And from 2011 until now, the focus of my life has been global missions, and that led through some really interesting meandering through another church on staff to eventually wind up at the church I'm serving in now as the director of outreach. So I oversee all of our local and our global missions. And so God's just been really good and gracious for me to experience what I did to be able to do what I do now.
Yeah, well, I love that. And one of the things that we talked about before we hit record is just you feel like you're in your sweet spot right now, getting to focus on global missions and outreach and stuff like that. You're in a cool place where you're kind of on the back end of your journey and you're just getting to love people, man. You're getting to pastor people, which is sometimes it's the dream for pastors because we get so busy we don't get to pastor people anymore. You know, we're doing all the things. You're getting to pastor people.
Don't tell anybody I got the best job there is.
Yeah.
Because I mean,
it's an awesome job.
2 weeks ago, I was in Kenya, And, a couple of weeks before that, I was in
Wow.
Nicaragua. And before that, I was in Poland. And I really am living a dream I never knew that I wanted. And
Mm,
so, I mean, I'm a 9 on the Enneagram. So, pastor shepherd is where is my go-to. And
yeah.
as we talk about my journey, I'm sure I will share the unhealthy side of being a 9 on the Enneagram, especially in the pastorate. But I really am the best place I can possibly be at 61 years old, still in the ministry. I mean, what do people usually retire to
Mm,
do? To travel. I get paid
yeah.
to travel, and my travel is paid for. I got a good gig
Yeah.
going on, so let's just keep that between us.
Yeah, yeah, man. Well, and one of the things I appreciated because you and I met. Most people before we have them on the podcast, I meet them, I talk to them, I hear a little bit of their heart. And one of the things that came across about your heart, it leapt off the screen from the first time that we really started talking, was just you really do, Loren, have a pastor's heart. You care about people, and I feel like I need to say this. This sounds super weird, but you know what I'm talking about. You've been in ministry long enough. I just wanted to thank you for that heart because a pastor's heart, a true shepherd's heart, is becoming exceedingly rare in
Mm,
a lot of today's church world. We got a lot of apostles and a lot of prophets and a lot of teachers and a
mm,
lot of evangelists, and I say that as someone who has those giftings and those roles. We don't have, in my opinion, enough pastors and shepherds who just want to care for the sheep. And I keep coming back lately to the words of Jesus. When he was talking to Peter, when he asked Peter at his restoration, "Do you love me?" Every time he asked him, "Do you love me?" "Yes, Lord, I love you." Jesus' answer was always, "Okay, well then, if you love me, feed my sheep." And I think in a world where we get so enamored with leadership and title and conferences and celebrity, it is refreshing to be able to meet with pastors who still have that shepherd's heart, because I believe that is what God is calling us back to, man. So I so appreciate your heart. You said you spent 16 years, I think you said, in ministry as a senior pastor. That was where you experienced the majority of your spiritual abuse. And the unique angle of this conversation, when you first reached out to me, you reached out to me, I believe it was on Instagram, and you said, "Hey,
correct.
I like some of your stuff. I don't like some of your stuff. I agree on some things. I disagree on other things." But you were very appreciative of the conversation, which we always love because that's what we're after. It's just good conversations about how to build healthy churches. We're not after agreement or consensus. But you said, "I really want to talk to you about the other side because I've been through my own healing." But you said instead of experiencing spiritual abuse in the mega church is where you actually experienced healing from the abuse that you had been through and needed to process in a smaller church. So it's a little countercultural to a lot of the stories that we've heard. So walk us through, man. What did your experience of spiritual abuse look like? And I know that's complex and it's layered and it happened over time, but so you're a senior pastor, you're in these small churches, and you experience this. Walk us through what that looked like, and once we hear the story of the pain you experienced, then we'll walk through how you found healing and how you found it in what I would say is kind of an unlikely place today.
And I fully agree. That's why I reached out to you, is just because of that. It was just such a different angle than where you've been on this journey with your podcast. But I've listened to every podcast that you've had so far, or most of them. Let me say, full disclosure, I haven't listened to every single one, but I have listened to
Well,
most
that's a
of
lot
them.
of podcasts and a lot of time.
I
We
know,
put out a
I
lot of
know.
content, Lauren. I'll give you a
So
break if you missed a few.
okay, just I missed a couple, but certainly over the last several months. And one of the things that I've heard you talk about is the systems that lead to abuse of the clergy to the laity in the megachurch. And I started thinking through those
Yeah.
pieces of narcissism, arrogance, and I'm boiling it down to those three: narcissism, arrogance, and then nepotism. And there are many more factors, but when I look back at my journey, all three of those were a part of the system, but they weren't being let out by the leadership. They were being let out by the laity. And
Yeah.
because of your um the way you focused on narcissism and multiple podcasts and all. It's helped me understand not every person that responds the way that I would call it narcissistic is necessarily a narcissist. But the system of narcissism it's all about me. And the church abuse that I experienced was from people who, but what have you done for me lately? What have you done for me? And so there's a narcissistic bent towards that mentality. Then there's the arrogant side of we're right, and if you don't agree with us, you are wrong. And since we are right and you are wrong, you are not good. You are not the right person for us. And the system that I came up in, the denomination I came up in, I've really been processing that over the last several years, along with with the abuse that I experienced in churches. And in my mind, I'm like, okay, I experienced this narcissistic, we're the ones that are in control, we're the ones that are right. That actually came out of my denominational experience. That was, I was led to believe, not like, we're going to stand up and this is what we are saying. It was just practically how we did everything was we were 100% right. And every other belief system out there is just a little less right or more less right, which means they're leaning towards wrong. So the system I was a part of.
And that's, Loren, that's actually a feature that we haven't talked about enough. It's a feature of narcissism. And it goes back to episode 1 when we talked about it. I don't know if you remember the acronym we use of special.
I do, special,
right?
Yeah,
but
special me.
But built into that acronym, narcissistic systems, and specifically, it's really easy to see with narcissistic church systems, I should say, is there's always language that, even though it's sanitized and it sounds good and it sounds holy, in a narcissistic church system, there is usually language that there's something special or more holy or more special or more right about what we do than what other people do. And it's built a lot into the multi-site movement. Not every multi-site church has this, of course, but a lot of the multi-site churches, it's you'll hear things like, we want to plant a life-giving campus, in every city or every city across our state. And in that language, you find this implication, this implied meaning that other smaller churches that are already there are not life-giving, right? And the more we fall into the trap of that language, the more concerned we should be. Doesn't mean we're in a narcissistic system yet, but it definitely means that the door's open to that. So I think that's huge for our listeners to hear. As you said that, I thought, hey, that language is one of the red flags that we look for in both our red flag reviews and our church safe assessments is, hey, if there's like special language about our church and our ministries, we've got to change that, because we have a different mission and a different calling maybe than the church down the street. But we're not more special. We're not more called. And each denomination, there's truth in those denominations. When we get to the point to where we say we've got the corner on truth, we no longer are willing to have a conversation. And a great example, and I'll kick it back to you. I just wanted to stop and make sure we hit this. We, our last episode, as we're recording this, so this will probably be way off by the time it comes out. But the last episode we released as we're recording this was with Tim Whitaker of the New Evangelicals. And we disagree on a lot of theology. We disagree on a lot of political stuff, but we agree on a lot of the systemic church abuse stuff, right? Well, as soon as we posted the video and the thumbnail that we had done the interview with him, literally I had probably, 10, 15 minutes later, it felt like, a person who has been super supportive of us, who has shared every piece of content that we've had. It feels like they've been with us, and all of a sudden they're in our messages saying, you guys are sinful, you're baby killers, you're all of these things because you aligned with a person who you disagreed with. And I remember asking them, because they said, your theology's off. I can't believe I ever supported you. And when I asked them, I said, how did you get that from even the first minute of that podcast as we made clear where our differences lie. And the answer was, well, I didn't listen and I don't have to, because I saw you had a conversation with them. And
With
if you had
him,
a conversation with somebody who's wrong, you're wrong. Yeah, like it was crazy. So
yeah.
that's what scares me about this denominationalism, but not just denominationalism, the tribalism of evangelicalism right now, that we have the market cornered on truth. Whatever our little corner is, we got the corner of that market on truth, and everybody else is wrong. It doesn't matter whether that's Calvinism, whether that's Arminianism, whether that's multi-site megachurch, whether that's small church. It doesn't matter what the expression is. When we feel like we're the only ones that have truth, we will stop listening, and slowly we'll become our own worst enemies.
And I would even add to that, outside of the churches, how we have this arrogance of, like, the way that I was raised in the Deep South, of how we make judgments about people based on their color, based on how we've been taught, and in a covert way, not in an overt way, and that was clearly a part of my experience in the church, that I even helped. I helped keep that going in the life of the church, because there were a lot of things that I did that were arrogant, that way of, we are God's chosen denomination. We are the ones God has given 100% of his revelation to, and nobody else has he given that. And that's a very arrogant attitude that has filtered down to the laity. And then that last piece of nepotism, was so many of the churches, at least the ones I was a part of, very family oriented, very even if they weren't all related to each other, their experience at that church made them family. And so the idea was, whether it was narcissism or whether it was arrogance, whether it was nepotism, that, you're temporarily here. You are not family, and we will go to the mat for family, but we won't go to the mat for you. And I practically lived that out through multiple experiences in the time that I was pastoring. My first church was really kind of a honeymoon. The only thing I would say, and I was I created a list. Okay, what church hurt did I have? My first church would have been a very common thing. Pastors here, Brother Loren, you're not visiting enough, and I said, okay, so I'm not visiting enough. What am I doing? Well, people think you're recreating too much. I said, okay, so let me ask you what my recreation is. Is it me going to seminary? Is it me going to my children's ball games? Or is it me mowing your church yard? Which one of those is my recreating? And it was funny, when I was in that first church, I was a lot bolder. I hadn't really been chopped down.
Sometimes that boldness gets beaten out of you after a little while in ministry. We all start bold and we get timid as we go on.
So let's go to church number 2 then.
Spiritual abuse is terrible because it causes trauma that can linger for a lifetime. And the pain that comes with spiritual abuse, that's the kind of pain that a person can feel deep into their soul. At the Spiritual Abuse Institute, we want to stop spiritual abuse through awareness, education, research, and practical resources. You see, at SAI, we're fighting for a future where spiritual abuse is rare and really hard to hide. But we can't do this without your help. As a donor-funded nonprofit organization, we rely on the support of our community for everything that we do. So, if you've been blessed or encouraged by this podcast in any way, would you consider giving a donation of any kind? Because by partnering with SAI financially, you are giving a voice to the voiceless. You're going to help more people heal from the devastating effects of spiritual abuse, and you're going to help us to challenge more churches to create safe and healthy environments for everyone. You can give a donation by clicking on the link in the description below or by visiting spiritualabuse.institute. Every gift counts, and we are hyper grateful for every donor and every supporter of this community. And hey, in May and June, we're looking specifically for 100 people who would commit to giving $1 a day to support SAI. By giving as little as $1 a day, you'll help us reach our budget for the rest of the year, and you're going to help us to get more content out, to help more people heal, and to do work with more churches who want to start doing things the right way. So if you've been impacted in any way by this content or the Church Disrupted podcast, would you consider joining the 100 for 1 campaign and becoming a financial supporter of SAI? Thank you so much for your consideration. And guys, thank you. Thank you to every single person who has already partnered with us financially. Together, we can end spiritual abuse, and we can help the church become a place of hope and healing for everyone again. I want to say this too, because this is especially in smaller churches, there's this attitude that a lot of times comes up of, and I remember being in day-to-day ministry and getting so frustrated with this, where people say, oh, well, we know what you do on Sundays, we know what you do on Wednesdays, but what do you do the rest of the week? Yet if you missed a hospital visitation or if you missed something that was going on, people would lose their minds and they would think you didn't care about them, So I will say, if you've never been in ministry and you're listening, the majority of pastors that I know, even the ones who are abusive and making mistakes, the majority of pastors work really hard. They do a lot of things that you don't see. And one of the most just kind of frustrating questions you can ask is, what do you do the rest of the week? Now, there are some of those pastors that are flying around, speaking at conferences constantly. They got their own private jet. You always see them at, playing golf somewhere and doing this, that, or the other. That's not the norm.
No.
So for everything we push on pastors about, that is not the norm. Most pastors that I know, one thing that I will say for them is they're generally hardworking people. And we need to give them their props on that. I have some questions about if the work that we're doing sometimes is the work we should be doing. But definitely more pastors than not are working harder than we think.
And that was really at that first church. It really was, God let me ease into pastoral ministry for that first 4 years. And then the next one was a very clear, no doubt in my mind, God moved me from my first to my second. There was partly because my second church was a traditionally troubled church. That was the verbiage. I actually applied to it, knowing about it before I was ever even remotely in the picture to go there. And that was its reputation. It was a traditionally troubled church. And my 4 years there did not do anything to change that. There was a really significant event at a deacon's meeting when a man who wasn't a deacon showed up. And earlier that day, I would have told you that was my best friend in the church. And that night he showed up to be a part of an attack squad that just ripped me apart and just, trying to destroy me so that I would resign and leave. And I'd only been there 2 years. And what was that over? Was that over a decision you made that they didn't agree with? Was it not you not giving power to a certain group of people? What was it? So the two things they said was I wasn't preaching the word, which I completely disagreed with. But what I did agree with was I was not preaching with power. When something like this happened to me, the way it was done was awful. And it was extremely painful to sit there, and the deacons who were in the room that were supporters of mine, well, we don't have to stay here for this. And they get out and leave all the others to complain about I wasn't preaching the word. And the other one was this guy who had come as who I thought was my best friend, I had been honest with him about, and the things I would say was like, I just don't feel like my deacons are supporting me, are behind me, are helping me move things forward. That was it. There was no moral failure. There was no, but I mean, one of the deacons that was a part of this attack, his wife was not a great supporter either, and to this day, I struggle with John Maxwell, not because of him or anything he teaches, but because this woman came to me with one of those big box cassette things, and it was John Maxwell had just started releasing this stuff, and she's beating me on the chest with this thing, saying, "You need this." Well, I didn't even know who he was at the time. I'm like, I don't need that.
Yeah.
I don't need, So there was this moment that night though, where I said, okay, you just let me do what I need to do. And by that, I meant, let me gather my resume, let me start looking, and I will be gone. You won't have to worry about me anymore. And God absolutely he did not release me. And I really wanted to go. And a couple of days later, I was reading in Proverbs, and I came across Proverbs chapter 16, verse 7. And it said, when a man's ways are pleasing to the Lord, even his enemies will be at peace with him. And I realized the way that this group came to me was ungodly, but God utilized it to do some work in me that needed to be done. There was that arrogance of, hey, I am the guy. What worked in my first church of, hey, this is how it's going to be, wasn't going to work in that next church. And so God was forming something in me to help me for the rest of my ministry to be able to survive. And so I actually did not do what I needed to do because God had not released me. And it was over 2 years before God released me. And I remember very clearly where I was and when it happened. And then I was able to go to what was next. And so then I went to my third church. And
so can we stop there for a minute?
Yeah.
Before we move on to your third church, I think there's some things there that I think there's important lessons for us. Like, one of the things that you talked about was you say, hey, I had a friend. That was one of the few friends I had in ministry that I could trust. They weren't a deacon. I didn't say anything bad, but I shared something with them. And next thing I know, they're in the room sharing the things I had told them and giving people ammo against me.
Correct.
That happens a lot because it is very difficult for pastors and church leaders. And this is important for all of us to hear. It doesn't matter if you've never been in ministry. If you want to help stop and stymie spiritual abuse, we have to understand this. It is very difficult for pastors to have close friends they can be real with, because the people you spend time with, the people you spend the most time with, are all at your church. And pastors learn very early. Most of us have had the experience, Loren, that you have, and it happens in different ways, but I had it. I've had people that I trusted. I said something. Next thing I know, it's taken to the church. It's weaponized against me. Well, that usually doesn't have to happen more than 1 or 2 times. And what happens is pastors begin to put on this hard shell, this protective armor. Okay. And we put on that protective armor and we stop trusting people. We stop letting people in. And we slowly start, as we get authority, dismantling systems that could hurt us again. Okay. So you're at that early spot. You're getting hurt by deacons and a lay board that's in charge. Well, that's how we got to the mega church model we have today, where the elder boards are a lot of times kind of handpicked, because slowly, as pastors have gotten influence and authority, they've said, how can I keep myself from getting hurt again? How can I keep other people from getting hurt again? And while that makes perfect sense, that overcorrection has actually removed needed accountability, from us. The problem is not that there's too much accountability in small churches. The problem is the power has shifted and the lack of accountability has shifted to the wrong spot. So in mega churches, a lot of times, in large churches, when we're talking about spiritual abuse, Why does spiritual abuse happen, Loren? I remember talking with Scott McKnight about this. He said that one of the number one markers of spiritual abuse is there's always a very unbalanced power differential. Okay. And in a lot of megachurch settings, that power differential is with the executive team or the senior pastor. Because, I came from a church, I was at a church at one point where the only way the senior pastor could be removed was by the elder board for heresy or moral failure. Okay. And I was told by someone on the executive team, it's impossible to prove heresy in a non-denominational church. So they have one way they can get rid of this person.
Mm-hmm.
It's only if they catch them with their hand in the cookie jar, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's it. They have to be able to catch them, and they have to be willing to say something about that. Okay. But if you go to the small church, we understand that's bad. That kind of power with that lack of accountability and the ability to deceive leads to spiritual abuse. But if we rewind and we go to the church that you were at, this sounds like a couple of the first churches I was at. Okay. Well, the same dynamic exists. It just switched from one pastor to a group of good old boy deacons and elders.
Correct.
Okay? And because they're the ones that hold all the power, no one could hold the deacons accountable unless people got so mad they called a whole church vote. And even then, usually the deacons could stymie that, right? So anytime we have power concentrated in one person or one group, okay, that's where we have a problem. And I go back to, we don't normally take our cues from culture, okay, but I think there's something we can learn from American culture. There's a separation of powers for a reason, because our forefathers knew from the beginning, if we give too much power to the president or too much power to Congress or to the Senate or to the Supreme Court, we're going to be in trouble. The way it's set up is so that every single group with power has the ability to check and hold the other group accountable in one way or another. They have to work together to move forward. And I'm just more of a believer than I've ever been, Loren, that's the answer for the future of church governance. That's what it looked like early on in the early church. We all have some power. We all hold each other accountable in some ways, but there can never be one person or one group that holds all the power. Okay. And if we do, abuse is inevitable. It's eventually going to happen, because if you may have one great pastor who can handle that power, but what happens when the next generation comes, right? Or what happens when you have a staff system where they can handle that power and one bad apple gets on the executive team? That's all it takes for this system to allow abuse. So that was one of the first things I wanted to say, and I wanted to share that, and then I wanted to get your opinion. Do you feel like that's right from your experience in both small church and mega church? Do you feel like I'm missing it? If so, why?
No, that's why, since I first started listening to your podcast, and I started thinking, wait, my spiritual abuse was different, but it was the same kind of different. It was different people in the system, but the system was the same. It's a group of deacons, a group of people, but the abuse was no different than someone at the highest level of a large church that is just filtered. Abuse just continually filters down, and I agree. I think our systems don't default to health. They default towards being unhealthy, whether it's deacons in a small church or the high level leaders in a mega church. And so you've got to be real careful and intentional about how you protect against that. And in the small church, there wasn't enough of I could say, hey, this isn't healthy, this isn't right, but I wasn't family. And so with me not being family, but this is the way we've always done it. So like it or leave, because we're going to be here and you're not. So, okay. Yeah. So there wasn't a groundswell from within the church to overcome the abuse. Even some people could see was happening. They were just, but I got to go to Thanksgiving dinner with them, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, that becomes the problem. Anytime in a church setting that we want to speak up against abuse, okay? Even when we see it, seeing it is only half of the problem. Standing up to it is the bigger problem once we see it, because it always requires standing up to people with more power in the system than you.
Yeah.
So for you, for the parishioners that saw it at that small church, it was, but those people have all the power. They have the power dynamic around a Thanksgiving table. They have the power dynamic, in the community. They have the power. So if I speak to power, to speak against abuse, I have to speak to power. And when I speak to power, I stand to lose something. That is the number one reason why people don't speak up against the spiritual abuse they see, because they fear what they're going to lose. And honestly, I mean, we've lost a lot. Loren, I lost everything that I thought I wanted and held dear at one point. And I had to get to the point to where I said, is this hurting people enough? And do I care about justice enough that I'm willing to lose? And I'm willing to lose deeply. When we invite hosts on the podcast, you've seen, we got about 8 different posts for our hosts for our roundtable discussions. One of the first things I ask them is, are you willing to lose? And how much are you willing to lose? Because you may not lose as much as me because I'm the face, but you're going to lose something, right? And I think about, I did, at the time of this recording, I did a funeral, and I don't get to do many of those anymore, but I did a funeral. And one of the toughest parts about this funeral was not just losing someone that I respected. It wasn't just trying to, cover the family in prayer and pastor them. It was watching as people sat in the audience that I used to call friend, who have completely blacklisted me once I stood up to spiritual abuse, right? And man, I just came home heartbroken because I missed those relationships. I miss those people who would call me a friend and I could call a friend. And so I just want to say that we got a lot of listeners that want to do something about spiritual abuse. There's no way to stand up to spiritual abuse without the risk of losing something significant. Okay. But here's why we got to stand up. If we don't stand up and we're not willing to lose something, then a lot of other people besides us are going to keep losing something. Okay.
Yeah.
So as scary as it is, and man, we talk almost every week right now to another church staff member who stood up to spiritual abuse and got let go. Okay. They are heroes to me. They are heroes. And it scares me sometimes, because I know we're wielding influence, and they're saying, we listened to your podcast and we've looked at what Church Disrupted and SAI is doing, and it gave us courage to do this. And on one hand, they're heroes and I am super proud of them. And on the other hand, I immediately go praying for them, because that's a heavy burden to bear, watching people make these decisions, right? So you've seen that kind of big and small, why people don't stand up to spiritual abuse. I'm going to give you 2 questions, Loren. I want to see what you think about this as well. And I just got a couple more things off of that, because your first part of your story, there's so much richness in it. I've got 2 questions that I ask for power and a power dynamic of a church. Who is the pastor accountable to? That's the first one. Who is the pastor accountable to? There should be a clear, quick answer. Another way of saying that is, who can fire the pastor? Okay. We need to know who can do that. It needs to be clear. It doesn't need to be hard, and it needs to be for more reasons than a documented moral failure. Okay. We got to be able to do that. But the second question is just as important. Whoever holds that pastor accountable and can fire them, who are they accountable? Right? Because if both groups don't have accountability, and it can't be each other, right? If both groups don't have accountability, and the group that holds the pastor accountable, their accountability needs to be outside the church and really not connected to that group or the pastor. Okay. So that when something comes up and we're not sure about it, it can go to an outside group. What do you think about those 2 questions? Because that's a conversation we have with churches in our assessments. And as a pastor in the mega church, I just wanted to get your opinion.
Yeah, there are some pieces of that I can guess at, but don't fully know. I know experientially, like in the church I'm in, that there is kind of at least 2 pieces of leadership that are not the same, and if you want to use board or whatever, that are not the same as then the lead team. So there is a financial accountable board, there is a ministerial accountable board, and then there's a lead team. How those 3 interact, I can't fully answer that question for our context.
Yeah.
So I don't want to, but I know, I honestly, recently had a conversation with some of our leadership who oversee kind of the risk management part of what we do. And
Hmm.
there was an event coming up where there was a potential for some information to come out that I had nothing to base this on other than what I'm seeing is exposed on, in certain churches of sexual abuse and things like
Yeah.
that, that there was the potential for something to come out, whether it was about someone at our church or not. And what I was asking our risk management people, who are we going to go to if we need to do an investigation? Because if there's anything you've learned from some of the things that
Yeah.
are going on right now, you better be ready with a
Yeah.
third party person to come in and
That's right.
hold the whole group accountable. And so I'm
Yeah.
even able to, at my lower level in leadership, at least speak into some of those places. And
Yeah.
so, you made mention of the fact that I'm in a really sweet spot. I'm in a great place. I'm not close to the leadership level, but and part of that for me is I've been able to lay aside this desire for high level leadership and be able to lean into submission to be able to do the things that really get me excited later in my ministry life. And so, but
Hmm.
I'm on social media. I'm listening. I'm trying to learn, even at 61, what
Yeah.
is the world saying about what's happening out there? And we better be aware of those things and how to respond to them. And you can see,
Yeah.
there have been a lot of things where the entity decided, well, we'll just take care of this internally. And it is not ending well when organizations say we're going to handle this internally. And so I'm at
Yeah.
least able to have some of those conversations.
Well, I'm so glad that you did, man, because that's, we talked to a lot of different experts from a lot of different places around this idea of spiritual abuse and abuse in churches, and every single one of them. And I'll throw out two names right now that couldn't be more different. From Scott McKnight, the seminary professor, conservative theologian, to Tim Whitaker, who leads the New Evangelicals. They've all said there's no way. I even talked to a private investigator yesterday. They all say there is nothing good that's going to come from an internal investigation. And any allegation of any kind of
Correct.
abuse in a church, it never needs to be internally investigated. It always needs to be an independent third party, and they tell you what to do with this, right? Because we're too close to it. So I
Yep.
so appreciate you speaking up to that, because, and I just think about it because of the season of life that you're in. One, you're in a healthy church that you believe in. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I know from our conversations, that is 100% your belief, that I believe in my church and it's healthy. So that allows you to speak up. I think the other thing that allows you to speak up, though, is, a lot of it, honestly, man, it's your age. If you're
Sure.
younger in ministry, you might be more scared to speak up, even if you feel like your church is healthy. You don't want to derail your career. And the same thing that makes you say, I'm not after high level leadership, I'm after making impact in my lane, right? Even if that means submission, is the same thing that allows you to speak to that with a little less fear.
Mm-hmm.
But it's something
No
that's
doubt.
important for pastors to know, especially for senior leaders, for executive level leaders, to say, hey, our staff, if we don't really ask for their opinions, we don't give safe places for them to share their opinions where we don't know where it came from, they may not tell us what we need to hear because there is fear there, right? And so anything that church leadership can do to remove that fear and hear the real opinions and thoughts of their staff, your lower level staff's going to be closer to the boots on the ground. They hear what people are saying, and they're going to have a lot of things. Like I hope that your church listens to you, and I don't know if that comes to be anything, if y'all end up needing it or not. I hope not, but if you do, I hope
No,
that they
and
listen
and
to you. And I'm
and
so
I
grateful
hope
that you
not.
did that.
I hope not too. My thought was, if it happens, it's too late to make the decision We need to be
Yes.
proactive and know the
Yes.
world we live in is seeking more significant accountability than most churches are willing to give. So we can put our head in
That's
the
right.
sand and act like that's not the reality, or we can approach things and say, you know what, we're going to have to do this different than we might would have done it 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And
Yeah.
there is, I do have the opportunity to speak into some levels a little different than some may, just because I know nepotism is one of your hot button words, but my son is on staff at the church too, so and he's at a
Okay.
higher level of leadership than me, and so there are things I get to I before I but when I found out about this event that was going to happen, and it was just encouraging women to break free of some things that maybe have spiritually,
Hmm.
emotionally, physically held them back. And
Yeah.
the reality was there was a potential for something at some point in time to be said that would need to be investigated. Let's just be prepared
Yeah.
if it does. And
Yeah.
so
Well, I
I
love
did
what
get,
you said. If we wait until something is reported, it's too late. And in our
yeah,
church safe assessment, so we're just ramping up to get started. We just launched SAI, so we're funding right now for that.
mhm,
But when we get the funding available for it, and we start these church safe assessments, that is one of the major things that we do with the churches that we assess and that we certify as church safe. Is they have two plans before anything gets started. Okay, the first plan is um, who is going to investigate this independently, who is our go-to, and who is our second choice if anything comes up. We've got those numbers on speed dial because sometimes your first choice may have a conflict of interest or not be available.
yeah,
Okay. The second thing, though, is we decide in advance how these things get reported so they don't have to be reported 100% internally in the church. How can they be reported to an external mediator that then comes to the church just to make sure in situations where victims are there that they're protected and to make sure that people can get in a room without retaliation? So, by having a way for people to report in a safe way and to have things investigated in a safe way, it protects churches right off the bat. And again, if allegations are false, it's going to protect the church and the people who are falsely accused. If the allegations are true, it's going to protect the victims, and it's going to protect the church and help them be above reproach no matter what the outcome is, because we had a plan where this is bigger than us. We're on the side of truth. We're on the side of loving people. Hey, Disruptors, I want to tell you about my friend Dustin Stepp and the East Tennessee Mentorship Association and how they can help you heal from religious trauma, spiritual abuse, or just become the best version of you. East Tennessee Mentorship Association is a veteran-owned mental health support and personal development organization that acknowledges the importance of your deeply held beliefs as a factor in their overall well-being. Through one-on-one mentorship sessions, culturally neutral small groups, workshops, outdoor activities, and more, they can contribute to your journey, offering battle-tested perspectives to help you move past your obstacles and toward your potential. If you want to change your life and you're ready to do your part of the work in a supportive environment, then call East Tennessee Mentorship Association today at 865-282-4403. That's 865-282-4403. Go ahead, give them a call, and tell them Church Disrupted sent you for a special rate. I'm telling you now, you won't regret it. And thank you to East Tennessee Mentorship Association for your support of the Church Disrupted podcast. One of the things that you talked about as well was you said, and I'm going to paraphrase this a little bit. This is what I heard, so tell me if I'm wrong. I heard you kind of say that with that second church, what the deacon said in that ambush meeting, what they said you needed to hear. You actually needed to learn some of those lessons. That wasn't
no
what was
doubt.
abusive. What was abusive was how they did it. Is that
Correct.
correct?
Correct. Absolutely. I own the kind of that arrogance. I had told you that when I went to that second church, I knew it to be a traditionally troubled church. And so I approached it, well, I am God's man to burn off the dross, to remove the chaff. There was an
Yeah.
arrogance of, that I had brought from how that had worked at my first church, and then and I think what happened was, as I was in that second church, and they said, "Oh, you're not preaching the word," and when I self-examined on this, I was like, okay, that's not true, because I can go back and look and show how I had used scripture in every sermon, because I had, all my outlines and everything. But there is a difference between not preaching the word and preaching absent of the presence of the Spirit when I'm preaching. And that was what God convicted me of, was allowing my sermon prep to be my personal time with Him. And rather than the other way around, was to be filled up spiritually, and the preaching was the overflow of that. And so no doubt that I had something to learn, but also no doubt the way I learned it was not done in a godly manner. And I'll tell you what another thing that I learned from that experience. The gentleman that hijacked me, that I told you would have been my best friend. You can take what you're about to hear and do with it what you will. That night, his house burned, and the next day, I found out about it about the middle of the day, and it didn't burn all the way down, but they had to move out, and nobody had called to tell me this had happened. I saw a lady, had gone to visit her, and she told me it had happened, and I had a personal dilemma. I was hurt so bad that night before. What should my response be? And the shepherd.
How do I care for this person?
Yes,
who just hurt me?
The shepherd came out, and I drove to his house and got out and walked up to him and shook his hand and said, "What can I do to help?" And that was also something that God used to teach me, is I formed you the way I did because you care for people, even in their most difficult moments. And so, that always, every time something that hurt me, I had to always examine, what have I done to get here, and what can I do to avoid that happening with me in the future. And there was I'll go ahead. I want to move to my third church, because I had a really significant experience. My family had one of those moments where you go, okay, this was pre that, and then everything was post that. And that day was on July 31st of 2007. I was pastoring a church, and my 16-year-old son dove in the swimming pool and broke his neck and was paralyzed from the neck down. And so,
oh my goodness,
we were, rushed to the hospital. Being in North Georgia, we were able to go to Shepherd Spinal Center, which is, a phenomenal spinal cord recovery place. And for the so early on, my wife and I decided that I would be my son's primary caregiver, because there are things you have to learn about taking care of a quadriplegic that a 16-year-old boy doesn't want his mother to help with. And we also had twin 12-year-old girls at home. So my wife was committed to taking care of them, and I was committed to being with my son. And I was having to learn how to be his primary caregiver. And for the first 5-6 weeks or so, he was starting to show some improvement. At 6 weeks after the injury, he actually took his first steps, and he was making progress. But he was inpatient at Shepherd Spinal Center for all of the month of August,
Yeah.
all of the month of September. So early on, the church was really understanding and really accepting, but 5, 6 weeks later, there began grumblings and rumblings. Well, he's not spending enough time with us, that kind of thing. And I was driving
Yeah.
back and forth between Atlanta and where our church was, and uh, it really, and I didn't even find out until years later how divisive the conversation had become over it's time for
Wow.
him to come back. Um and that one was painful years later, that I found out that there were actually people who not only felt that way, but they actually voiced it, that it's time for him to come back
Mm.
and spend more time with us. And about 6 months later, I did have somebody who had been there through all of that, and he and I were together, and his sisters. These are all people older than me, but they're all standing together, and he looked at me and he was like, I just want to thank you for the way you lived serving your son during that. And he was, I know there was some friction there, but thank you for the way you exemplified that, serving your family.
Yeah.
And he and his sisters were, their father had been a pastor, well known, well loved pastor in the community. And I'll never forget what he said to me. He looked at me and he said, "Our father was a pastor to everyone but his own family." And
Mm.
I knew in that moment I had done the absolute right thing, and I would do it 1,000
Yeah.
times more. And it was those kinds of things that like, can you not understand? Like, he was literally in the hospital for 87 days. And in those 87 days, I spent 23 in my
Mm.
bed. All the others were in a hotel room or somewhere where I was close to him so I could take care of him. He was my priority. And he still has the impact of the injury, but he's married. He danced at his wedding. He is a
Mm.
Fellowship of Christian Athletes
That's awesome.
director in the area, and his wife is about to have their fourth child in June. And so it's
Mm.
but here it's almost 17 years later, there's still a little bit of the hurt of, hey, in that
Yeah.
moment, I needed the pastoring of me longer than some people were willing to give that to me. And
Yeah.
so that's one of those marking moments.
Yeah, man, I can't imagine. We all need pastors, including pastors. I think about my wife is a therapist, and one thing I know about therapists is any therapist worth their salt has a therapist. Every therapist needs
Hmm.
a therapist because of what they carry. Every pastor needs a pastor, and sometimes the pastor needs to be cared for by the congregation for a season. The pastor
Yeah.
needs to become a sheep, and I think it's one of the things that I'm so passionate about with spiritual abuse cases is especially thinking about larger church staffs. And I love the way that Natalie Runyon says it. Okay. Natalie Runyon, don't know if you're familiar with her. She wrote Race to Stay, runs the Race to Stay account. But she says, pastors, if you're going to hire them, also make sure you can commit to pastoring. Okay.
Hmm.
Because a lot of times church staff, they're loved, they're cared for, they're pastored until they're not. And all of a sudden you lose your job. You lose your job, you lose your community, and you lose your care because nobody is there for you because it's this weird thing. And I always remind pastors, even when you have to make the tough decision and you fire someone and you part ways, them and their family are still a sheep in your flock until they find another place. They still need care throughout that process. Okay. And instead, too often, we don't care for them because it's awkward. And not as often, but still too often, we ask them to sign an NDA and not tell people what's really happening. Hey, here's your 6 weeks. We hope you're okay. And that does so much damage. Like one of the things that you said, from your experience, I think is true of most spiritual abuse cases. And what you went through was horrendous, Loren. I'm so sorry. Like, just can I just take a minute and say that? And I know that you know this, but that was not God's heart. That was
No.
not how he wanted those people to treat you. And even 17 years later, I'm so sorry you had to go through that. But at the same time, one of the things you said that I think is true for cases that maybe, but people don't go through anything nearly as bad as that, but it still is damaging. You said 17 years later, I still deal with the hurt sometimes thinking, right? Those wounds can stay open for a really long time because we think about them as wounds when, grief is much more like waves. It's
Mm.
waves that hit you time and time again. But some with spiritual abuse, just like any type of abuse, here's the issue. If we don't heal from that abuse, the waves don't get lesser. And if we don't heal from it properly, I love what Tim Ross says. He says, we can't leave what we don't properly grieve. Okay.
Hmm.
If we don't heal properly, that pain can hurt just as bad or worse 17 years later as it did when it first happened.
Yeah.
And because there's a lot more people that realize that have been through spiritual abuse that have PTSD from it. And if you don't realize what those triggers are and you don't heal from that, you don't do the work with a therapist or a professional to really let that stuff go and figure out how to process it, then you can get emotionally hijacked and struggle years after the fact because something reminds you of it. Wow. I
And
just still can't believe that you had
I
to go
don't
through that.
I don't have a lingering. I think the wave is a good way, and it's more ripples out from, you throw a rock in a pond, and when it first hits, it's huge, but then it ripples out. I'm well
Yeah.
into the short ripples on this,
Yeah.
especially, not being there. It's only when I like bring it up in times like this where it
Hmm.
kind of, gives you a catch. But I will tell you
Yeah.
that, when this guy that told me, was son of a pastor who everybody in the community loved, I
Hmm.
have told that story so many times, and I hope that it is heard by pastors and that they
Yeah.
understand that there are people they're now in their 60s. They still hurt over the fact that their father was a pastor to everyone but their own family. And I will
Hmm.
never apologize for pastoring my son. Never, ever. And nor should I. And there was one more episode at that church that probably hurt more than that one did. My wife's mother died in June of '08. And it came time for Christmas, and traditionally Christmas is, we have a Christmas Eve service. And I was doing all I could to be there for that Christmas Eve service. And my wife was about to experience her first Christmas without her mother, and her father
Hmm.
was still at their family home about 4 hours away. And finally, just a couple of days before Christmas, I decided, you know what? I'm going to pastor my wife. And I've got somebody who
Yeah.
can lead this service. Well, a couple of weeks later, I get called on the carpet and I get told that, this is a huge
Hmm.
event. And absolutely, I should not have gone and been with my wife on Christmas Eve for her first Christmas without her mother. And I had an episode of boldness then. I was with the personnel committee of the church, and I looked at him and said, my heart breaks that you do not understand that it was more important for me to be with my family than it was for me to be here on Christmas Eve. And
Hmm.
and that was what I found in what I
Yeah.
found that I could describe that came out of my experience there was um, the deacons were very similar to what I had experienced in my second church, and I began to recognize an anxiety cycle. And the Tuesday
Hmm.
after the deacons meeting on Monday was always the relief, regardless of what happened on Monday night. It was the relief because it was over. And some nights there was nothing, other nights there was plenty. And about for a week and a half, I was good, and then the anxiety started, and the anxiety started, and by that Sunday before
Mm.
that next deacons meeting, I was a wreck. And when I finished serving as a pastor, 15 years in the pastorate, I was on Zoloft, and I was um, dealing with what I would call minor depression, but I was hurting.
Mm-hmm.
And for the next several months,
Yeah.
even though I didn't have deacons meetings anymore, I found myself living in that anxiety cycle because it had been such ingrained in me for so long. And now I don't, it's
Yeah.
that the wave of that is way small and barely a ripple anymore. But early on, after I left, it was something I really had to struggle with.
Hey Disruptors, have you heard about the Church Disrupted community? It's an online community for Church Disrupted listeners where you can ask questions, you can connect and talk with other like-minded people who've experienced church hurt and spiritual abuse, and you can ask honest and vulnerable questions without judgment of any kind. And that's without the trolls, the anger, and the constant arguments that tend to come with social media. And the best part is it's 100% free because of our gracious and generous donors. So, if you've experienced church hurt, spiritual abuse, or religious trauma of any kind and you're on the healing journey, I want to invite you to join me in the Church Disrupted community. You can join at disrupted.church or spiritualabuse.institute. And we're also including a link below where you can join just through the description. So, what are you waiting for? Join the Church Disrupted community for free today. We can't wait to meet you. I appreciate you giving us the gift of your vulnerability there. That took a lot of courage, a lot of honesty, a lot of vulnerability to say, hey, I was a pastor and I was on depression meds, because so many pastors they dismiss mental health these days. It's just not too long before the recording of this episode, we had a very well-known, pastor who said PTSD isn't real, depression isn't real, ADHD isn't
mental
real.
health.
When the truth is, it's only not real if you haven't experienced it. Because when you've experienced that dark night of the soul, you know that it's real. And I appreciate you as, not only someone who's been a pastor, but someone who still is a pastor to say, hey, I needed medication in a time, right? I needed this, because that gives people permission. It gives other Christ followers permission to say, you know what, I may not be okay. And that doesn't mean I'm not going to be okay for forever, but I need both the help of God and I need the help of sometimes medicine.
Yeah.
Sometimes, professionals. I think that's super important.
It wasn't terribly long, a couple of months, and I was off of it, and I've not been on anything since then. It was a very situational anxiety that I was experiencing, and all of that helped get me to a place that when I had the opportunity to step back into church, the one that I serve now, that I could pull from all of that experience to take what has helped me and not throw away what has hurt me, but at least say that doesn't define who I am moving forward. What I really struggled with most of my career was people have a very specific definition of what a leader is, and it's what I consider to be a directional leader. You tell people where to go. You tell people how to go there. You are a leader if you do it this way. And I am what I refer to as a relational leader. And I lead people well by being in relationship with them. I lead best by being in relationship with people. Therefore, I can't lead a team of 15 because I don't have the bandwidth to lead that many people relationally. Yeah. But because I have the capacity to lead relationally, my administrative assistant is leaving. She had an opportunity to, something's going to help her family, is nothing to do with our relationship at all. In fact, she told me, you're the best boss I've ever had because you care about me. And so the things that I learned that hurt me, I can take and help form who I am as a leader moving forward. Yeah. And, and even the guy that put me off on this podcast, I mean, he's a guy that'll just come sit in my office and we just talk. And I give him
Yeah.
time to just to be engaged in his life.
That's huge, man. And I think, you talked about your grief is more like those ripples. And then every once in a while, you'll get another wave crash and it's just ripples. But those waves are few and far between. I think the reason why those waves are few and far between for you is because you've done the hard work of healing. I know, and we can't get into that with the time left that we have today, but I know you've done the hard work of healing. And sometimes people just don't know how to do the hard work. Sometimes the work is so excruciating for healing that it feels safer to stay in the hurt, right? But the difference between the person who does the work of healing to overcome and heal from spiritual abuse and the person who stays in it is the difference between 17 years later having waves of grief or 17 years later experiencing it almost as if it's happening all over again when you get hit with the wrong trigger. So I just want to encourage our listeners, as difficult as it is, as painful as it is, embrace the work of healing. Lean into that. See a therapist if you need to see a therapist. If you need time with us, reach out. We try to have as many calls with people as we can. There's limits to that, but I talked to 8 people yesterday. Okay. If you're in crisis, you're not sure what to do to take your next steps of healing, let us know. That's why we're starting hopefully 7 new table groups in August, where we walk through 12 months of a healing process with people to process that with others in a safe way. It's why we're working on resources to do that, but it's going to hurt. It is worth the pain to process and heal, because if you don't deal with the pain now and process it, it will stay with you for years and decades to come. And we want you to be able to get freedom from that. Just like Loren, you've experienced freedom from the really deep pain that you experienced in the church. And I think one thing that I wrote down, I just got a notepad in front of me, and I wrote this down when you were telling your story, and I kept coming back to it. I said, well, that's true of that part of the story. It's true of that part of the story. It's true of that part too. It's true of most spiritual abuse cases, right? Spiritual abuse tends to happen most often, and it tends to happen most intensely when we stop seeing people as children of the Most High King and we start seeing them as objects to use.
Yeah.
That is when spiritual abuse happens most often and most intense, because when you were going through what you went through with your son, the church saying, hey, we need you to be back more. You're not with us enough. We need you to be here more than you're in Atlanta. That was them saying, hey, we need the object to be used of a pastor instead of seeing you as a son of the king who was hurting over your son and needed to be pastored. When your wife needed you to be with her first Christmas without her mom, and you said, someone else can do this one special service of the year so I can be with my wife on Christmas Eve. When they said, hey, no, you should have been here with us, we wanted Pastor Loren. That was, we see you as an object to be used for our own gain instead of a person. We see that in mega churches. We see that in small churches, but we see that in almost every spiritual abuse case. And I've not realized it until now, but it's when we see a person as an object instead of as a child of God. And it's very, very important. So I think that's a reason why it is so prevalent in mega churches from the pastoral side, because I think in smaller churches, spiritual abuse can happen still from the pastoral side. It happens
No
a lot
doubt.
from the laity as well.
Yes.
Yeah. But I think one of the reasons why it's so common in larger church settings is because the larger the church gets, the more staff we have, the more separated we get from.
Correct.
And it gets really easy to see the people as, I'll use a term that, you may not have heard it in your church. You may have heard it somewhere else, but we start seeing people as things like giving units and servants instead of, they don't have names anymore. They have designations. And that's a really dangerous place to be. So pastors who are listening, always keep front and center. These are people, these are children of the Most High King. And when we see them as God sees them, it's really hard to abuse them. And when we find out, hey, maybe I've abused you on accident. I know I did that. I did that quite a bit as a pastor. It's so easy to apologize when you see them as children of God and not as someone to be used, right? Now, before we started this podcast, long before we started this podcast, I had to make a lot of calls and apologize to a lot of people as I realized my complicity. I mean, that's something I've loved about this conversation, Loren. You have been time and time again willing to call your own fouls and say, I was arrogant. I had a lot to learn.
No doubt.
I was too arrogant. I needed to learn that lesson. And another time you said, "Hey, I'm in a healthy mega church. I'm in this great church." Yet at the same time, I said, "Hey, whoa, what happens if there is an allegation? We need to decide now the right way to do it." If more pastors and more church staff would do what you have done in this podcast episode, be willing to call our own fouls and ask questions, we will get so much healthier, so much more protective, and the world will have less arrows to throw at the church when we call our own fouls. So I appreciate you so much. There's one thing I wanted to come back to, I wanted to say before we finish, and I'll get your final thoughts. And we talked about sometimes the right thing can be said, but it's in the wrong way. And what is said is not abusive, but it's the way that it happens. There's this dichotomy that you probably heard in this space from people talk about spiritual abuse, and then people who kind of combat spiritual abuse. A lot of times, church leaders who are saying it's not as big of a deal as it is. But there's this thought, and I've even said it myself, that, hey, being held to account or being told that your sin is not spiritual abuse. Okay. And again, I've said that. I totally get that. But at the same time, sometimes being held to account or being told your sin is sin, or being mentored, sometimes it is spiritual abuse because we said the right thing, we did the right thing, but we did it in the wrong way. It is possible to do the right thing and do it in an abusive way. So sometimes if someone comes to you and says, "Hey, this hurt me," it doesn't mean that what you said was wrong. It may be how you said it, right? And that's something I think we need to look into as well. I'm so sorry that I hurt you. Not I'm sorry if that hurt you. I'm sorry you feel that way. I'm sorry what I said hurt you. No, I'm so sorry I hurt you. That was never my intent. Help me to understand. How could I have said that differently? How can I be better in the future? And if we'll give real apologies like that and learn, a lot of times we'll just find out it's the way we did it, not what we did. So I think that's a very important distinction. But Loren, I appreciate you. I appreciate, again, your honesty, your vulnerability, your ability to call your own fouls. You and I've, we had enough conversations to know you're in a healthy mega church from your perspective that has helped you heal. You've experienced healing there. You also know that mega churches aren't perfect. You see some of the same things that we see. We're not going to agree on everything. But conversations like this lead to conversations like the ones you had with your leadership team. What do we do if this happens, right?
Yeah.
And those are the conversations this podcast exists for. So as we get ready to head out today and bring to close this episode, and again, man, I just appreciate you sharing your story, and to remind us that spiritual abuse isn't just a mega church problem. But for our listeners who, there's really two audiences I want you to speak to. The listeners who have been through spiritual abuse and are trying to heal and re-engage with the church, but they're struggling. And then the second audience is pastors and church leaders. Doesn't matter the size. Okay. From your experience of spiritual abuse and knowing how damaging that is, what's one piece of advice that you would give to the person looking to heal and re-engage with the church? And then what's one piece of advice, if you could only give one, that you would give the church leaders?
The advice to the ones that have been hurt is don't allow that hurt to disengage you from the church Jesus died for the ecclesia, the gathering of the saints. Don't let people keep you from spending time with people. I've had, people ask me, what was the greatest thing about being a pastor? And what was the worst thing? The greatest thing was the people, and the worst thing was the people. And a lot of times it was the same people.
Yeah.
Don't let what happened because of people impact your relationship with Jesus Christ. And if I could give advice to the church, is do not dismiss someone's experienced hurt. You may not understand it, but don't dismiss it until you've heard directly from them what they experienced. And, if there's anything I'm learning from all the sexual abuse stuff that's out there, it's one of the biggest things these churches did not do was listen and care for the people who said, I was a victim. And so, churches, just listen, stop trying to protect the institution. And like you were saying earlier, help protect the people. And if there's
Mm,
sin that has led to this issue, you can work through that, but start with caring for people. And that, if I could, it would have been awesome if I could take what I know now at 61 and flip flop and have started at
yeah.
25, knowing what I know now at 61. That'd be phenomenal. Well, guess what? That's why you have 61-year-olds in your life, is because you cannot fast track wisdom. And the experience that I have is a wisdom centered experience, that I didn't make the right decisions, made a lot of mistakes. I learned from those. And wisdom is something you can only gain by experience and time. And so
Yeah.
allow people like me into your life. Allow somebody who's been in the ministry to just, hey, here was my experience, and allow us to be encouragers for you as you're younger and growing in the ministry.
Yeah. I love that. There's so much power, Lauren, in just listening before we respond, listening instead of defending. And one of the things, I've said this for years, long before I started talking about spiritual abuse or even knew what it was, but most people today don't know the difference between being loved and being listened to. So if
Mm,
you want someone to feel loved and you want to love them well, just listen. So I think
that's
that's how
good.
we end, because this is
Yeah.
the most quoted verse that I leave in social media comments with Christians who are angry about things we say. It's James 1:19. Be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. Because
Yeah.
when we do that, we're going to love each other better, and we're going to learn everything is better when we're quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. So let's all be
Yeah.
a little quicker to listen and a little slower to speak this week. Guys, I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did. And I can't wait to see you on the next episode of Church Disrupted. Until the next time, grace and peace. We'll see you guys next episode.